Welcome back to part two of this introductory lecture on social identity theory. Glad to have you back. This is probably my favorite lecture in the whole course. I love it. I'm absolutely fascinated by the experiments that are described here. You might think at first glance that the material covered in this lecture isn't obviously relevant to the social psychology of work, but please just bear with me. In next week's lecture, you'll see that it's actually very relevant. Now, much of this lecture requires a visual to comprehend what's going on. So in between the PowerPoint slides, I will cut to a series of video clips of me explaining the experiments. So I hope you enjoy this. As I said, I think these experiments are absolutely fascinating, and they tell us so much about the nature of social relationships. Curiously enough, in order to understand social differences, we must first examine differences between inanimate things. So let's do that now. What is accentuation theory? Rather than start with social psychology, we're going to have to start with a field of psychology called visual perception studies. Perception researchers carry out experiments that ask respondents to distinguish between various forms of perceptual stimuli. This might be, for example, colors, shades of light, or weight, etc. What these researchers have found is that we tend to overestimate visual stimuli that have value to us compared to visual stimuli that are neutral to us. Now, this can be a bit tricky to understand, but don't worry, I'll explain it as we go along. Basically, accentuation theory suggests that we exaggerate differences between things. Now, it is also possible to extend this logic to the exaggeration of differences between people and groups. Thus, we accentuate similarities with individuals who belong to the same group, and we accentuate differences with individuals who belong to different social groups. In this way, accentuation theory can be said to explain prejudice and stereotyping. Are you still a bit confused? Well, no worries. I'll explain these findings in a bit more detail as we go along here. This is so fascinating. As I said, psychologists have found that when a thing is relevant or meaningful to us, we tend to slightly overestimate its size or its magnitude. But when a thing is irrelevant, neutral, or of no value to us, we tend to be pretty accurate in estimating its size. This is such a strange phenomenon, but it has been replicated in a number of experiments over decades. The conclusion is generally the same. Subjective perception does not correspond to objective reality. In other words, our estimates always contain some error or noise, but the error is not evenly distributed across the stimuli. Let me give you an example using jars of sand and jars of chocolate. Now, what do jars of chocolate and sand have to do with social psychology? Again, just bear with me. Imagine, if you will, two jars, one large jar and one small jar. Now we conduct two separate experiments. In the first experiment, we fill the large jar with sand and the small jar with sand, and then we ask the subjects to estimate the weight of each jar. In the second experiment, we filled the large jar with pieces of chocolate and the small jar with pieces of chocolate, and again, we asked the subject to estimate the weight of each jar. Guess what we would find from carrying out these experiments? The magnitude of the difference in weight would be larger for the second experiment than the first. Why, you might ask? Because chocolate is much more relevant to us than sand. Because chocolate is more relevant, we overestimate the magnitude of the differences. Let me give you another variation of this experiment. Okay, so let's do an experiment of our own. This time we have one jar of chocolate, standard issue Snickers bars, and one jar of sand. Now, let's say we asked 2,000 people to estimate as best they can, simply by holding the jars, their weight. Okay? But before we did this, we weighed them ourselves on a scale. And let's assume that our jar of chocolate was found to weigh, I don't know, this looks like about, let's say 525 grams. So that's the objective weight, the actual weight. And then we weigh this jar of sand, and we find that this weighs, I'm going to say, I'm just estimating here, but let's assume that this is an accurate figure. Let's say 2,750 grams. Okay? So let's assume that these are the actual weights, the objective weights. Now we ask these 2,000 people to estimate the weight for each one of these jars. If Tajfel's theory is correct, his theory of accentuation, then what we can expect with the jar of chocolate is that, of course, we'll get wildly different estimates in terms of how much this weighs. Some people will be way off the mark. Some people might say, this is about 25 grams. And some people might say, this is about 4,000 grams. But the laws of probability would suggest that most people would estimate the weight to be somewhere around the actual weight. But if Tajfel's theory is correct, because the chocolate is meaningful to us and it has relevance to us, we're likely to overestimate the weight of this jar of chocolate. So if we were to add together all 2,000 estimates, then the mean would likely be greater than 525 grams. Now, if we were to ask the same 2,000 people to estimate the weight of the jar of sand, again, most people would be fairly accurate around 2,750, which is the actual rate. Some people would be wildly inaccurate, saying, oh, this is 6,000 or 7,000 grams or 200 or even 20 grams. But most people would be around here, the actual weight. But if Tajfel's theory is correct, then he would expect the average across those 2,000 to be less than the actual weight of 2,750 grams. So again, what this suggests is that we tend to exaggerate or accentuate differences between inanimate things based on whether they're relevant to us, whether they're important or valuable to us, like chocolate, or whether it's irrelevant or neutral to us, such as sand. And in these kinds of situations, we overestimate the weight of the things that are relevant to us, and we underestimate the weight of the things that are irrelevant or less relevant to us. Here's another experiment that illustrates the same logic surrounding accentuation theory. This time, instead of jars of chocolate and sand, I want you to imagine 4 coins. Right? One large British coin and one small British coin. We'll call these two the stimuli. And then there's one large South African coin and one small South African coin. We'll call these the controls. For this experiment, 200 respondents from the United Kingdom were shown the stimuli, that is the British coins, and the controls, that is the South African coins. And they were shown these coins in pairs. For each pair, they were asked to estimate the sizes for each coin. Now, let's think about our expectations based on accentuation theory. Because the British coins have value to British people, then we can expect some level of perceptual overestimation in terms of size difference. But because the South African coins do not overtly have the same value to British people, then we can probably expect a more accurate estimate of the sizes. And indeed, as it happens, this is exactly what the experiment found. The mean difference in size for the UK coins was 0.29 compared to 0.20 for the control coins. Alternatively stated, the large British coins were estimated to be 24.2% bigger than the small British coins, compared to only a 17.4% difference in magnitude for the South African coins. Again, we confirm here that people tend to exaggerate differences between things that have meaning to them. Their subjective perceptions of things do not correspond to the objective reality. Let's take a look at one more experiment to better understand the concept of perceptual overestimation. This experiment has to do with the length of lines. Now, rather than just describe this slide to you, I'm actually going to show you this experiment. For me, I think this experiment is the clearest example of accentuation theory. So if you still don't understand it, hopefully you will after seeing this experiment. Have a look. Okay, so now I'm going to show you another classic experiment. And this one involves the estimation of the length of lines. Okay, so the experimenter is going to present a series of lines to the participant and ask the participant to estimate in centimeters the length of those lines. But the experimenter does it in a very specific sequence. Now I'm actually going to start with block 3 and then explain block 2 and finally explain block 1. So we're going to do it in reverse order from what's on the PowerPoint slides. So the first block that we'll talk about is block 3. And in block 3, the experimenter presented the respondent with 8 completely random lines without any logic. Some were longer, some were shorter. Okay. 8 lines. And the experimenter asked the participants to estimate the length of each line in centimeters. And what the experimenter found is that the estimates of the length were pretty accurate across the entire sample. Right? So that was block 3. Now we'll look at block 2. So in block 2, a series of random lines was also presented to the respondent. So again, some longer, some shorter. But in this case, when the lines were presented, they were presented in 2 groups. So we'll call them group A and group B. But there was no clear logic underlying why these lines were assigned to group A and why these lines were assigned to group B. And again, what the experimenter found is that the estimates across the entire sample of the length of these lines were pretty accurate. Now here's where it gets interesting, where we talk about block 1 of the experiment. Now in block 1 of the experiment, the lines were presented to the respondents in descending order from longest to shortest. So there were 8 lines again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's a very clear sequence here. They start at the tallest and they end at the lowest. And like with the second block, in the first block, the lines were presented to the participants in separate groups, where again we'll call this first set of lines group A, and we'll call this second group of lines group B. All right? Now here's where it gets really interesting. The results are, again, in my view, completely fascinating. The experimenters focused particularly on estimates of these two lines right here. So I'm talking the shortest line in group A, so the shortest of the longest lines, and the longest line in group B, so I'm talking the longest of the short lines. And they found something very interesting in comparing the sample's estimates of the length of this line and the length of this line. What they found is that the magnitude of difference between the longest short line and the shortest long line was 100% greater than the actual difference between the shortest long line and the longest short line. So what does this mean? How would you interpret this? Essentially what this means is that the participants were dramatically underestimating the length of the longest short line and dramatically overestimating the length of the shortest long line. It's interesting. The reason for this, according to the social psychologist, is that when we categorize, we like to differentiate as much as possible between those categories. So this experiment represents, I think, a simplified exercise in stereotyping. And here's the segue from estimating differences between inanimate things like lines or jars of sand or chocolate or coins into differences between people and between groups. Because exactly what's going on here is the same thing that goes on when human beings stereotype each other. When we stereotype, the group differences are exaggerated, right? The difference between people belonging to group A and people belonging to group B are exaggerated beyond the actual differences. And at the same time, the differences within each of these groups are minimized, right? So we're assuming more homogeneity within the groups and more heterogeneity between the groups, right? It's fascinating. So it's an experiment involving the estimation of the length of lines, and what we find is this built-in tendency to exaggerate and polarize differences. And human beings, for whatever reason, don't like this sort of gray area here where the tallest short line is close to the shortest tall line. And so what we do is we underestimate the short one here and we overestimate the long one here in order to accentuate those differences between the two groups, A and B. That's why it's called accentuation theory. And so we finally arrive at the end of the Week 8 lecture. In this second half of the lecture series, we've looked at various experiments that sit at the very heart of accentuation theory. Hopefully by now you should have a basic understanding of the assumptions of this theory. So what have we learned? Well, we know that people have a remarkably consistent tendency to exaggerate differences between inanimate things, whether those are lines or jars or coins. Our perceptions of those things do not match with the reality, and we tend to want to accentuate differences between them. Now, if this exaggeration of differences is evident among lines, you can surely imagine that it also happens within social relationships. As long as we impute value or relevance into something or to someone, we generally perceive that thing or that person differently. In this way, these experiments can explain why prejudiced people will overestimate and underestimate differences when it comes to, for example, race. Skin color is an objective reality, but prejudiced people exaggerate the differences between races in a way that non-prejudiced people do not. It's curious, isn't it? We can make inferences about interpersonal and intergroup relations based on a set of experiments asking people to estimate the length, height, and size of things. This lecture has now provided what I think to be a nice segue into the material that we'll discuss next week, where we move on from jars and lines and coins, and we look at the applicability of these principles to intergroup human relations, particularly in the workplace. We'll see you then. Bye for now.